Hi, my name is Claire Welsh, and I'm going to present the concepts discussed in the readings on cultural interpretation and design. These concepts include postmodernism, reflexivity, Orientalism, globalization, and interpretivist and positivist approaches. Barnard describes the work and theoretical position of Evans Pritchard as a precursor to interpretivism. However, considers him to be mainly a modernist anthropologist. Evans Pritchard was against thinking of anthropology as a science or natural science, and instead thought of the discipline as more of an art. He compared anthropology to historical science, as they both seek to understand and describe a series of integrated events. Considering the discipline as a translation of culture, Evans Pritchard saw the goal of the anthropologist to study the collective mind of a culture, and then translate these ideas into comparable ideas from the anthropologist's own culture. This is not a process of literal translation, but more of an analogous one. In undertaking this translation, he stressed the importance of not being too literal. For example, making the record inaccessible to other cultures outside of the culture being studied, or being not literal enough, which would not accurately depict the quintessence of the studied culture. Barnard describes Evans Pritchard's theoretical position as being reactionary to structural functionalism, whereas he describes the work of Clifford Geertz to be a movement forward towards the new methods and goals of interpretivism. Geertz championed the concept of the thick description, an extremely detailed and layered ethnographic method. He considers the fine details of a culture as the evidential base for considering larger theoretical concepts. From Geertz's point of view, through observing social action and the creation of political power, ethnographers can begin to understand the semiotic system, and hence the culture itself. He stresses the limitations of cultural theory, that they are only useful for specific studies and are unable to predict behavior. The theory of reflexivity generated ethnographic studies that were focused on comparison. These comparisons were between cultures with similar characteristics, or between the ethnographer's own culture and the culture being studied. An example of extreme reflexivity would be to use the studied culture as a background for the ethnographer to study his or her own culture. Barnard also describes more moderate approaches to reflexivity as a more balanced combination of personal reflexivity and theoretical reflections. Orientalism was introduced by Edward Said as a way in which the Western world divided itself from the Eastern world, and hence began to create a hierarchy of power during colonial and post-colonial times. Most recently, James Carrier has considered how Western anthropological studies have focused their studies elsewhere in the world to the detriment of the understanding of their own cultures. Carrier discusses how this trend is now beginning to reverse itself. Barnard discusses the globalization theories of Norman Long. Long describes three aspects of contemporary anthropological theory: globalization as the movement of people and symbols, localization as the relationship between local knowledge and external pressures, and relocalization as the recreation and assertion of local knowledge. Barnard goes on to compare these theories with diffusionism. Barnard describes the general characteristics of postmodern anthropology, of which interpretism can be considered part of or a precursor to, as criticizing modernist assumptions and methods, as being against the concept of the grand overarching theory, as acknowledging the incompleteness and limitations of ethnographic study, and critical of counterpositioning, such as can be seen in Orientalist approaches. Norman Denzin describes postmodern ethnography as a moral discourse. He encourages ethnographers to experiment with literary techniques and different mediums. Through attempting to express subjective truths, the ethnographer should focus on lived experience, praxis, and multiple points of view. To consider another reading now, the Ozanne and Hudson reading contrasts positive and interpretivist approaches to consumer research. They outline the differences in goals. Positivism is described as aiming to be able to predict outcomes, whereas interpretivism is about creating understanding. The assumptions of the two approaches are also opposite. Positivism assumes a single reality, whereas interpretivism allows for many individually or collectively perceived realities. Positivists believe that phenomena are non-contextual and hence would have the same outcome in controlled conditions, whereas interpretivists assume the opposite. Positivists also assume that behavior is driven by external factors and/or internal states, whereas interpretivists believe that humans choose how they behave. The types of knowledge generated by the two approaches is also different. Positivist study creates generalities, minimizes the variables in a study in order to understand the relationship between a controlled set of variables, and maintains a clear division between subject and researcher. Interpretivism, on the other hand, produces knowledge that is derived from observed contextualized behavior, accepts the limitations of research in that it will not be able to fully understand causal relationships, and seeks to create knowledge through the subject and researcher working closely together to develop meaning. In conclusion, there is a correlation between Bernard's theoretical position and that of Ozanne and Hudson. Both believe that in having the flexibility to select and/or combine a number of ethnographic theories, even if those theories are in opposition, contemporary ethnographers will be able to approach knowledge generation in the most relevant and useful way for any given situation. Bernard states that there are three different strands of anthropological thinking: structural, interactive, and interpretive, and that these strands are not mutually exclusive. He also states that the blending of old ideas of all sorts seems to be the safest bet. In the Ozanne and Hudson reading, they describe their goal of the paper as this paper discusses the ways to examine the conflict between these two systems of interpretivism and positivism so that alternative approaches may be envisioned.